Good morning, you are watching Kishore Manch. I am Rahul and channel number 31 of SWAYAM Prabha and NCERT's official YouTube channel. We bring you the session of science with the new chapter of our environment, class 10 science. And to present this wonderful session, we have Dr. C.V. Shemre, Associate Professor in the studio with us. Thank you very much for joining with us. And before we begin, we just want to let you know the numbers, toll-free numbers of Kishore Manch, 1-800-111-265 and 1-800-112-199. And our email ID is ciet.kishoremanch@gmail.com. So let us begin with this new chapter, our environment. This is the part 1 of the chapter, and we would like to know about, Dr. Shemre, more about our environment. Well, what are we going to learn from this chapter?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Before we get into the session, let me greet each one of you, all the viewers, the 74th Happy Independence Day.
Yes.
And as we are celebrating Independence Day, the 74th Independence Day, so we wanted to talk about what we have done to our environment over the years since after independence. So that's what I will be talking a little bit about in this session. But before I get into that again, let us see what we have in this chapter, the class 10 science chapter, our environment. So what are the topics that's covered in the chapter? So can you please take me to the slide? So these are the topics, if you look at that. So it talks about ecosystems, what are its components, interdependence of living organisms and with the environment, food chains and food webs, energy flow in the ecosystem, how do our activities affect the environment, ozone layer and how it is getting depleted, that is something that's there. Global warming is not there in the chapter in class 10, but since the topic is so important and it is, we cannot avoid talking about global warming if we are talking about environment. So although students have studied about this in class 9, I plan to have this covered even in this chapter. So we will be going back to discussing a little bit about global warming later, not today, maybe in subsequent sessions. Then we also have how do we manage garbage that we produce. So these are the chapters that is there in the textbook.
All the topics are related to our daily lives, actually.
Yeah, actually everything about the environment is always related to our life, our daily life. And that is the reason that we are talking about it. So what do we do in this? So we have several chapters out there, but today we cannot possibly cover all of those. So what are the things that we're going to discuss today? So these are the topics that we are going to discuss today. For example, how have we done with the environment? How far are we faring with the environment after independence? That means that how have we used the resources or exploited the resources that we have, and what is the status or what is the nature of environment right now since independence? So we'll be discussing a little bit about that. Then we'll also talk about why should we learn about the environment or the ecosystem, So that is something it's important to understand before we actually learn about it. Otherwise, if you don't know why you're even learning about it, then there's no point of learning about that. So we'll be discussing something about that. Then we will also talk about human attempts on how we have been trying to understand or study ecosystem so that we will be able to take the right decision for the ecosystem, or in terms of its protection, conservation, or in terms of its improvement. So these are the basic 3 topics that we are going to cover in this session. So that means that we are not really actually going to get into the nitty-gritty of the contents of the chapter. We will do that in the later sessions that's coming up. We're going to have at least 3 sessions in this chapter regarding this chapter. So but for today, as I said, we're going to cover those just 3 topics and we will continue with the discussion. So yeah.
Okay.
So to carry on with the discussion, as I said, post-independence, what have we done to our environment? So let us discuss a little bit about that since we are celebrating our Independence Day today, the 74th. So during the 74 years, what have we done to our environment? So that's something that we want to discuss. So can you please take me to the slide? So as you can see in the slide, I have just mentioned about colonial period, because it's also important what was happening just before independence, because that's all connected with the things that happened after independence. So during the colonial rule, as we all know that we were ruled by the British, and it was like they had systematically started managing the resources that we have, especially the forests. As you all know, British, they were already developed people. They had already gone into industrial revolution in England. So the same ideas somewhat they were brought into India, but more of the exploitations or management, they use the term management, but it was more of exploitation of natural resources that was happening in India. So systematically there was exploitation of the natural resources, especially the forest, without including people who are living in the forest, who are actually dependent on the forest, so ecological people. So it was like, yes, you take decisions for the forest, but you're not involving the actual people who are living in the forest or depending on the forest. So it all destroyed or deteriorated the condition of the forest and the environment in general. Then during the period of independence, while we were almost achieving the independence, just prior to 1947, we all know what Gandhiji was fond about. I mean, his philosophy or his idea about how we should live, you know. And that's something, there is so much that we can learn from his philosophies. For example, he was more into self-reliance. How can we live self-reliant?
Right.
How can we not depend on other countries for a livelihood? So he came up with different ideas like, okay, we can live this way, we can grow our own crop, grow our own food, we can do our own work, we can manufacture few things by our own hands using the technology that we can develop. So it was more about trying to live with the resources that we have around us, you know. So agriculture, like crop, okay, you food crops, you plant your own food crops so that you can depend on it, you can survive on it. Then you can, I mean, through those spinning, you know, charkha, which became very popular because of Gandhiji.
Right.
So how do you spun your thread, cotton, you know, so that you can produce clothes out of that. So those were the ideas, and how can you learn through that, you know. Education was part of that, then employment, labor was part of that, and also livelihood was part of that. So it was a very holistic approach of, I mean, visualizing how we should live, you know. So it was very sustainable, I would say that.
This is a kind of human ecosystem, as we all are connected internally.
Yes.
Each and everything which is available in the environment. And if we get something from the environment, that we have to give something back to them.
Yes, so his whole idea was that we should be dependent on the environment, but we should not be exploiting. We should try to use the minimum possible resources from the environment to the level of subsistence. That means as long as we are able to survive, we should not look beyond greed. Greed should not be there in us. That's his philosophy. So it was a very sustainable idea. But then after independence, what happened was that our population increased, then poverty was very rampant. We wanted to develop, you know, we wanted to lift the livelihood of people throughout the country. So what do we do then? Development was the approach. So India had to come up with different ideas, you know, how to develop, how to manufacture, how to improve the livelihood of different people. So in that process, what happened was that we took the approach of development at all costs. So you can see the slide there.
So somehow, somewhere we have to limit our needs.
So it was something like post-independence, as you can see in that slide, it was about development at all costs. That means that we were not looking just at what's going to happen to the environment. If we do this, what happens to it? We were at least concerned about that, but more concerned about how can we get more out of the environment. So that was development at all costs was something that was very rampant at that time. So following that, at the same time, you know, even in other countries throughout the world, environment movement was catching up because everywhere there was this attempt for development, you know, and so industrialization, then because of which pollution and all kinds of natural resources were exploited to the maximum possible.
We have seen maximum industrialization with in the span of last 50 years.
I would say it started like 100 years before Industrial Revolution, like towards 1870s, 1880s. It was really, you know, it took really a bad turn since then because we started using coal, and because of coal, machines and tools, and it really helped us in enhancing our production, you know. But production was enhanced definitely, and we could get a lot out of that. But then in the process, what happened was that we also deteriorated the environment in a very huge way. You know, unprecedented deterioration or degradation of the environment was happening because of Industrial Revolution. Because of our attempt to develop, you know, because of our attempt to lift up the livelihood of people in different parts of the country in order to get away from this something called poverty, because we were really poor, you know, when we got independence. And so since we wanted to come out of that, the approach that we took up was, as I said, development at all costs. So industrialization started, we started producing all kinds of things like steel, chemicals and whatnot, cement. Mining was, exploited in a big way, began to be exploited in a big way. So things were happening in India. Same way as I said, things were happening outside of India. So everybody was talking about, environment. How do we take care of the environment? So that was something that every country, especially those big countries, developed countries, started thinking about. And interestingly, the first big conference of the world bodies, different countries, happened in 1972. That was called the United Nations Conference on Human Environment. That happened in Stockholm, Sweden. That was in 1972. So since 1970, that was, I would say, the biggest meeting of different leaders of the different countries. So during this, in this meeting, the then Prime Minister Srimati Indira Gandhi, she was also part of this meeting. She attended this meeting. And so world leaders, maybe not in the capacity of the Prime Minister or the President, but different world leaders attended that meeting. And so different decisions were taken. So going ahead, moving ahead from there, we also came to, across different socio-environmental movement taking up. For example, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, it became very popular. Then the Chipko movement, where, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, he was like, he took the leadership in that, and he also proved that, as you can see in the slide, he proved that you have to take care of the environment or the forest if you really want to get away from poverty or if you want to develop. In order to develop, we need not exploit the environment. In order to develop, you actually have to take care of the environment. That's something that he came up with. He proved, So those several other movements also started coming. Now that every time something happens, for example, Yamuna River, then you go to south, then Kaveri River, Bangalore, the lakes are polluted, and all kinds of, pollution we talk about nowadays. Air pollution is something that's very common now. So all discussions related to environmental pollution and environmental degradation started, increasingly being talked about after that. Then at the same time, what was happening was that, as I said, development at all costs was a focus. We were focusing on the products, how we get the things we did not really took interest, because we were so much into producing more and more, in the process, we were not neglecting the process. How did we get that? Are we even polluting the environment or things, or how much of natural resources?
We just see the end product.
Yes, that was all we considered during that time. And so what happened was that, because of which, as you can see, green revolution was something, that students might have heard about. So because we want to produce more grains, more food, as I said, food was, population was increasing, food production had to be increased accordingly. So then, because of green revolution, what happened was government gave out subsidies, free electricity, water, machines were used, pumps were used to pump, fertilizers were used rampantly, pesticides were used rampantly, so that, you have more crops. But in the process, after years, we realized that, okay, in the process, we have, degraded the environment so much, the soil, the water, So things were happening, although our interest was good, intention was good, but the result turned out to be quite a disaster, because of which we are seeing now. It's not just about the green revolution. All other industrialization attempts to develop had cost us in some way, maybe in the form of air pollution, or maybe in the form of water pollution, or maybe in the form of soil pollution, somehow it always had a negative impact. We don't want to
try to see the results, which will we see after decades.
Yes, and something that is also difficult is that when you are doing something and the impact is not seen immediately, so sometimes you cannot visualize, and you don't have so much time to experiment that. For example, now we are looking for vaccines, For vaccines, you cannot just go and use that vaccine to people. You have to try out. You have to give yourself some time to try out. For environment, it takes years. For example, when plastic came out for the first time, we did not know that it was going to be such a nuisance. We were so happy that a product called plastic came out, which made our life very convenient.
Very easier,
very convenient. But now, look at that. We are talking about how to get away with plastic. What is the alternative for plastic, synthetic plastic? How can we produce biodegradable plastic? So that is a thing. So the products and the process, there was imbalance in that. We were more focused in the products, because of which the process was neglected, because of which the environment was, degraded in a huge way. And so what happened after that? we find that also poverty, there were islands of, in the sense that islands of richest prosperity was there. Some people became very rich because of industrialization, whereas poor people, there were oceans of poverty,
yes.
So poverty was all around, but definitely some section of the people got benefited out of that. So we could see islands of prosperity in the oceans of poverty. That's a line that I picked up from one of the book of Guha and Madhav Gadgil. Then following which, what happened after that? Following the UN conference on human environment that I just mentioned, indeed, Indira Gandhi, she made some changes in the constitution. She suggested some changes in the constitution, as you can see there. In 1977, Article 48A was added in the constitution, which states that the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. So this was something very important to have in the constitution, so that we know our role and responsibility in taking care of the environment. So after that, there was many changes. For example, Department of Environment was set up in 1980, which eventually turned into Ministry of Environment Forest in 1985. Then now we call it Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which was renamed in 2014. So all these changes were happening. So since all these changes were happening, so the way we should learn about environment also changed, eventually. Otherwise, if we learn the same way, then things will not change. So we needed to change the way we learn in the school, in colleges about environment also. And meantime, there was something very interesting happening. In 1991, Sri M.C. Mehta, he filed a PIL, public interest litigation, in the Supreme Court, saying that environment is not being taken care by the citizens of the country, because of which there is rampant pollution.
Okay.
So, because of that PIL that he filed in the Supreme Court, the Honorable Supreme Court took cognizance of his petition and came up with a decision saying that, okay, what he said is right, and implementations were happening based on the suggestions that Sri M.C. Mehta gave. One of those recommendations of M.C. Mehta to the Honorable Supreme Court was to make environmental education compulsory in education system, So it is very important to talk about this when we are talking about environment, which we are studying in the schools and colleges. So since 1991, Honorable Supreme Court said that, okay, we are going to have environmental education as a compulsory subject throughout education system. That means not just in schools, but also in college. I don't know if you have ever studied that, but definitely there is a semester course, which is compulsory for all students. Environmental studies, you call that subject. So that's all also because of this.
Part in NSS in the college.
Yeah.
So it was actually drive
to
motivate the people around us in the college vicinity, and if we, had some camp.
Yes.
So it has actually a potential.
Of course.
To motivate the people so that they will come and join us.
Yes, of course. So those are some of the attempts that are being made right now. But I think those are not enough. We need to do more, But what I'm trying to say is that because of that PIL that was filed by Sri M.C. Mehta, things change, in the education system especially. So we have this something called environmental education now in our education system. And we study about it in different ways, in different subject disciplines. But today, if you look at it, it's where everybody is talking about climate change, and so climate change is picking up in a big way, and so it's true as well. But the focus should not only be on climate change, even though if you look at different other countries, they are more concerned about climate change. Of course, it is a very important area or issue that the world needs to tackle. But besides climate change, the environmental issues, for example, the waste that's lying around you, the water pollution that's happening, the water which is not drinkable, why it has turned that way, or the soil that is being polluted, or the air that is polluted. So this should also be equally given importance, So these are some of the things that's happening following 1947, So things have changed drastically. The way we exploited the environment, the way we learn environment, the way we are approached the environment is now, even the government of India is coming up with different strategies regarding how to tackle environmental problems, So then let us now go to why should we learn about the environment?
Yes. That's the main question, I think, of this session.
This is very important because we have now talked about the problems. How did we even get there? Why did the problem even start? Now, if we look at why should we learn about the environment, students always think that when they're studying about the environment, when they come across something, some topics related to air pollution, water pollution, forests, you know, or our environment, this chapter, they think that, okay, this, I'm going to study this so that I learn something to score some good marks and get away with it. But the whole idea of having these kinds of topics or chapters in the textbooks, it's beyond that. It's beyond learning or beyond knowledge. It is also about, you know, how do we act from our learning. That's more important.
Yes.
You might know everything about environment.
Because if they add something, it is not for him or her only, it is for the society.
Yes, so you have to act, you know, you have to do something. Your knowledge should not be just stagnant with you. So it is beyond knowing about the environment, but doing something about the environment. So that is the focus. So if students are watching this, I will encourage them that this topic we are discussing is not just because we want you to score well. Definitely, if you learn about this, you'll score well. But beyond that, it is about taking actions. How can you apply your learning in your daily life? So that's something that's very important, and that's the most important aspect of having all these topics in your school curriculum, you know. So, and one more thing, students' daily life, they can take actions. At the same time, they're going to grow, you know. They're going to become in some way some leaders, maybe a leader in a family, leader in the community, leader of a state, a country, you know. They can become leaders in different capacities, leader of themselves or for two people, you know. But in some way, they are going to be able to take decisions. And so when they know all of this, they will be able to take the right decision. So it's very important to have the right knowledge. And you can also see that these days, people are talking about environment, but there are so many misconceptions or, you know, alternate conceptions. Wrong informations are being, spread. So it's important for students to, you know, learn to be like scientists, so that they know the facts and figures and they talk accordingly, not just believe on what other people are saying. So they need to understand this. Okay, if something is happening, is it really happening? They need to go and cross-check, not just because, okay, if now we talk about climate change, so they can go back and see, is climate change really happening? There is so much debate about how much human intervention has caused climate change. You know, they can all go back and study that instead of just believing, instead of just, you know, rote memorizing whatever is there in the book. So they need to speak like scientists, go and figure out what is really happening. Is it really happening? Then why it is really happening? So they need to ask more questions. So when they're going to study this chapter, our environment, so I will encourage students to ask different questions as they go through this chapter. For example, we have several questions. I have some of those in the slide. Can you please take me to the slide?
Yes, please.
Anyway, so for example, what happens if you introduce new fruits or trees or plants in an ecosystem, you know, in some new place? What's going to happen? So students need to think about it. So it's not just like, oh, something is growing in the backyard or in a forest, so they don't even care. So it should not be like that. So if you're a student, if you're a science student, be observant, try to understand why, when new fruits are introduced, what can happen. I have more questions, so if you look at that, can you please take me to the slide? What will happen to the environment if human beings are not there? You know, so that's something that students can think about. They can spend time, there's no harm spending some time thinking about our role. For example, now that we say that it is because of human intervention that all these environmental pollutions and degradations are happening. So imagine if we are not there, what's going to happen to the environment? Will it have positive impact? Will it have negative impact? You know, they can just think about all these issues. What happens to the ecosystem if GMOs, that is the genetically modified organisms, or the living modified organisms are introduced?
Okay.
How changes in gene frequency can impact the ecosystem? We have had several sessions on heredity and evolution where we talked about changes in gene frequency can impact the population. So all these things are connected, you know, genetics is connected with ecosystem, environment. So the society is connected with the environment. So everything is so connected. So students need to think about all this holistically. So, or for example, how disturbance to the ecosystem can impact our life. For example, now we're talking about COVID-19, and we say that one of the reasons is that it could be possibly because we have disturbed the forest in such a way that, because we say that, okay, the carrier, initially the carrier of this reservoir of this this coronavirus, that is SARS-CoV-2, which is causing COVID-19, came from bat. That is the initial, I mean, now we are thinking that scientists are saying that it could be. And so bats come out from the forest. So why would they come out? Because, you know, because we might have exploited, we might have disturbed their habitat. So that is one of the reasons. So what happens if we just keep on disturbing the ecosystem? What could happen to us, you know? What could happen to the life of people in terms of disease or in terms of whatever, you know, in terms of air, because we call forest as a lung, you know, green lungs. So if we destroy, deteriorate, or deforestation of that happens, then what's going to happen to the life of human beings? So we need to ask more questions. It's not just about understanding ecosystem just as it is in the textbook and try to memorize some of those concepts, but it is beyond it. Try to really question, so what happens if this is not there, if this is there? You know, students need to ask all of these questions. So that I will leave it at that. We will discuss more about that when we actually talk about the chapter in the subsequent sessions. So I want to take you to one of those very interesting experiment that human beings have conducted on ecosystem. How we can, I mean, not manipulate, but how we can, you know, understand ecosystem better, so that we can come up with some better ideas of trying to address the issues that we are facing. For example, if there is some problem in the ecosystem, then how can we fix that? So in order to understand all of those, some researchers in the US actually came up with a big study, you know. So that is called, if you can take me to the slide, that is called, they constructed this something called Biosphere 2. So please take me to the slide.
Okay.
Biosphere 2 was an attempt by researchers in the US. So what did they do was that they constructed this Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2, why it is 2 is because Earth is Biosphere 1, you know, because Earth, so natural Earth is Biosphere 1, and so they were constructing mini Earth, you know, so to say. So they were trying to depict how actually the Earth functions through this Biosphere 2. So they constructed this big domes, you know, with all kinds of, like, as you can see there, it had different ecosystems, desert, oceans, human beings were living, savanna, grassland was there, rainforest was depicted. Then there were you know, coral reefs were there. There was agricultural land where they actually had cattle, they had chickens, you know, they were growing food crops. So all these facilities just like we have on Earth. So they were trying to depict this in this small area of 1 hectare, just about a little more than 1 hectare area. So this was constructed in somewhere close to Tucson, that is in Arizona in the United States. So this dome, huge dome, was made up of this glass and steel, and it had 3,000 plants and animals. And 4 women and 4 men, they lived in that place for 2 years and 20 minutes, you know, in that closed system. So it was a closed system, so because they were trying to depict exactly what happens in the ecosystem, in like what happens on Earth. So they were trying to depict that, and so they had people living there, they had agriculture going on there, they had something similar to oceans, they had deserts, they had grasslands, they had rainforests. So all the systems that we see on Earth, that was depicted there. So what happened then? So why did they actually even do that, you know? The purpose of that was that, as you can see in the slide, scientists wanted to prove that an entirely self-contained human system could sustain life. So they thought that, okay, if we depict exactly what is there happening in this on Earth, it might be possible, you know, to sustain life in a closed enclosure also, if you provide all those facilities. Another thing was that, because, you know, human beings have been trying to colonize Mars, colonize Moon, you know. So they thought that, okay, once they come up with this, if this research came out successful, someday we should be able to colonize these places, which I thought is not the best idea. We are not able to take care of this planet that we have, and we already start thinking about colonizing Moon and Mars, which is not the best thing to do at this time. So we should be more concerned about taking care of the planet that we have right now. So then another purpose was that by studying this mini Earth, they thought that they might be able to understand the planet's delicate balance, which could provide ideas how best to protect it, you know.
Right.
So that they thought that, okay, we could come up with some understanding, some ideas, we could learn something from that, so that we can take decisions in on this real planet, Biosphere 1, that is the real Earth.
Yes.
So it was both ways. Like, one was they thought that it could be possible to have a self-sustaining system in a human-made system also. Another thing was that they thought that if that was successful, someday they could colonize, they could use that in colonizing Moon and Mars. And another thing was that they thought that they could come up with some ideas which they can actually implement on this planet Earth, the Biosphere 1. What were the findings? So it's interesting that they found that more than 1/3 of the flora and fauna had become extinct, you know. So many, 3,000, as I said, mentioned in the previous slide, 3,000 plants and animals were introduced. More than 1/3 of those plants and animals became extinct, they died, including most of the vertebrates and all of the pollinating insects. You know how important insects are in the ecosystem. If there are no insects or pollinators, the universe is going, I mean, the ecosystem is going to collapse, because, you know, because of pollinators, you have new set of new crops coming up, new plants coming up, new trees coming up. You know, the role of pollinators is so important. So they found that all these pollinators. Most of the time we
see the fact that bees are very important for us.
They are very important. It is said that if there are, if pollinators disappear from this planet Earth, then in a few years' time we are not going to have food to eat.
Yes.
You know, so those are some of the questions students need to think about. And another finding of the research was that some plants thrived, whereas some plants vanished. You know, some plants overtook, became very invasive, whereas some plants disappeared. Then trees were very weak. For example, on this planet, I mean natural planet, natural Earth, trees go through a lot of stress. Wind is there, sometimes storm is there. So in the process, you know, they become strong. But in that close enclosure, the trees were without any stress. It was cool. I mean, it was very easy life for them. But in the process, they were very weak and they were brittle, you know. But what was interesting is cockroaches thrive. You know, we always say that you must have heard people say that if there is a atom bomb is thrown, then cockroach will be the only organism surviving, you know, something like that. But even in this system, they found that cockroaches, they thrived in that system. But oxygen level came down drastically in spite of having all those plants, you know. So plants are supposed to be providing you all the required oxygen, but they found that oxygen level drastically reduced, and so they had to pump in air. So it was no more a closed system, so they manipulated in some way, because people were living, the 8 people were living there, and so they had to survive, and so in the process they had to pump in some air into that system, you know. So that was something that they did, that they found. Ecosystems, ultimately what they found is that ecosystem is delicate and complex, and it is difficult to create a self-sustaining system. So it is ecosystem is delicate and it is complex, and we cannot, you know, manipulate, we cannot create something of our own. And so all we have to do is try to take care of what we have right now without manipulating, by trying to leave nature as it is as far as possible, try to not exploit or overuse the resources. Sustainable use of resources is something that we talk about. And so how can we minimally use the resources, you know, but also meet our needs, but not our greeds. Our greed can never be met. Human needs are minimal, you know, actually. But it is our greed that is spoiling everything, that is resulting in all this deterioration and degradation, unprecedented degradation of the environment. So these are some of the things I would want students to think about before we actually get into the main chapters, main topics of the chapters, you know. So I have an activity actually for the students before they come back for the next session. So that's an activity where I want them to think about, find out from newspapers and internet how factually incorrect information are provided by public figures. We have seen this so many times, even not just in India, even outside, I mean in US and Brazil and all those places, those countries. So these public figures, you know, they tend to give out wrong information. And since these people are public figures, people believe in what they say, you know, that's very dangerous. So that's so it's good for students to understand how incorrect informations are being given out. So they might just want to go back to the internet, since it's lockdown period, they're learning from home using internet. So they might just Google using internet, or they can go to also look at the old newspapers over the years, because there is environment section in newspapers. They can look at that, what people are saying, public figures are talking about. Are they saying even the factually correct things? For example, especially there's so much incorrect information going about climate change and ozone layer depletion, which we will be discussing about this in the later sessions. Okay. And I also want them to survey organisms in wild, not roam very far. Just go out around their house and see in where there is garden which is not exploited, natural place. They can see how many animals, insects, tiny organisms are there in that place, and compare it with so-called garden where we plant flowers, So natural and human controlled places. So they can just go and compare those two places and look for the organisms that they can find in those two places, so that they understand what happens, what exactly is happening in nature. So if we exploit, if we grow same kind of flower or same kind of crops, what could happen? So they will have some idea through this activity. So that's something students might want to go back and think about it, or look for answers for this. And as I said, if you have more questions, you can put in your questions, so that we have a few more sessions coming up on this chapter, Our Environment, where we can address to your queries and questions. So I'll be happy to answer to those questions and queries in the subsequent chapters. But for today, so that's what I wanted to share about how we have, utilize the natural resources over the years since independence, and how things have changed in the way we learn about environment. And I just gave an example about how human beings have tried to understand the functioning of ecosystem, how have we tried to even manipulate, the ecosystem and things like that. So those are some of the things that I just want to put forward as an introductory session before we get into the main chapter in the subsequent sessions. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have any questions?
Yes. Sunny asked you, ma'am, is there any substitute of oxygen?
Oh no, that's something that you cannot even think about.
Is there any life on Biosphere 2 without oxygen?
No, that's not possible. As I said, the oxygen level came down, and people were like, they were sleepy, they were dizzy, feeling dizzy. Those 8 people who were living there, they were very, they were not active anymore. And so they found out that it was because the oxygen level had drastically reduced. And so in order to make up those oxygen level, raise the oxygen level, then they had to pump in air, as I said. Otherwise, if it was in a natural system, from where do we get the oxygen? We get oxygen from the plants.
Yes.
And that system, Biosphere 2, also had plants, several plants. So they thought that, okay, photosynthesis will happen because the dome was steel, glass, and so sunlight will enter, photosynthesis will happen. And so people living there, 8 people living there should have enough oxygen. That was the assumption. They thought that that would be possible. But what they found was that, no, oxygen level was not enough for people to survive there. Okay. And so they actually had to pump in more oxygen.
So basically it was an experiment with the humans.
Yes. So those 8 people, they volunteered, those 8 scientists, researchers, they were researchers themselves, and so they were living in that, they were studying about it, they studied themselves, what was happening with them and what was happening in that ecosystem, closed ecosystem, So those are things happening, and there's so many ecologists and environmentalists working in different places, even right now trying to understand the ecosystem better, so that we can better manage the ecosystem that's around us.
Okay, that's our responsibility, and thank you very much, Dr. C.V. Shimre, to present this wonderful session, and it is really helpful. If you have any question after this session regarding this chapter, do send us an email on ciet.kishoremanch@gmail.com. Thank you very much, Dr. C.V. Shimre. You came here and to present this wonderful session, and this is our responsibility. This is not only environmental studies in class 10th or any other class. This is our responsibility to save our earth and to protect our ecosystem. So thank you very much for being with us. This session is over now. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.